Wyoming Territory, 1872. The silence was the first thing a man noticed, and the last thing he ever truly grew accustomed to. It was a living entity out here, a vast and profound emptiness that pressed in from the sprawling plains and the distant, tooth-like mountains. Ethan Cutter had lived with it for 5 years, had invited it into his home, and made it his only companion. The silence did not judge. It did not ask for things he could no longer give. It simply was a reflection of the hollowed-out space inside his own chest. His ranch, nestled in a shallow valley carved by a creek that ran thin in summer and froze solid in winter, was his fortress against a world of noise and memory. Each fence post he had driven into the hard, unforgiving soil was a nail in the coffin of his old life. Each head of cattle that bore his brand was a testament to his survival, a stubborn refusal to be erased by grief. He stood on the porch of the small, sturdy cabin he had built with his own hands, a mug of coffee warming his palms against the morning chill. The sun was just beginning to crest the eastern hills, painting the underbellies of the clouds in strokes of pale rose and gold. The air smelled of pine from the nearby timberline, of damp earth, and of the clean, sharp scent of impending autumn. He was a man in his late 20s, but the hardness in his gray eyes and the quiet set of his jaw belonged to someone much older. The war had chiseled away his youth, and the loss that followed had sandblasted the rest, leaving behind something durable and solitary. He believed in the logic of the wild. That which stood alone was strongest, for it depended on nothing and could therefore lose nothing. Attachments were liabilities, anchors that could drag a man down into depths from which there was no return. He had learned that lesson in a shallow grave marked by a simple wooden cross, a grave he could no longer bring himself to visit. The rhythm of his days was deliberate and unchanging. He rose before the sun, worked until it set, and fell into an exhausted, dreamless sleep. His world was one of leather and sweat, of the lowing of cattle and the creak of his saddle, of the endless, whispering wind. It was a Spartan existence, but it was his. He had built it piece by piece from the wreckage of his heart, a life as stark and beautiful as the land itself. He asked for nothing and expected less. But the world, with its noise and its chaos, had a way of intruding. It arrived on the back of a tired horse, carried by a neighbor from a ranch 5 miles down the creek. Jebediah, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard seasons, reined in his horse and accepted the offered coffee without dismounting. "Morning, Ethan," Jebediah said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Just came from town. Figured you'd want the news." Ethan leaned against a porch post, his expression unchanging. News was usually bad. Rustlers, drought, or another foolhardy settler paying the price for underestimating the land. "What news?" "Something strange," Jebediah admitted, taking a long swallow of coffee. "Silas Croft's men are in town. You know, the big cattle baron for down south. They're setting up for some kind of auction. At the saloon." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "Not for livestock, Ethan. For a woman." Ethan's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. He said nothing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The idea was vile, a throwback to a barbarism he thought they were trying to escape. Redemption was a rough town, a collection of clapboard buildings clinging to the edge of civilization, but it had rules. It had a sheriff. This felt like a violation, a sickness brought in from the outside. "They're calling it a bride auction," Jebediah continued, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Claim she's an indentured servant, and they're selling her contract. Legal, they say, but it smells foul. Word is she's some high-born lady from the East, fell on hard times." Ethan's mind registered the information with a cold, detached clarity. It had nothing to do with him. His world was circumscribed by his property lines. The town and its sordid affairs were not his concern. He had enough ghosts of his own to contend with. He had no room for the troubles of strangers. He had learned, through brutal experience, that the instinct to help, to protect, was a siren song that led only to ruin. He had tried to protect his wife, Sarah, from the fever that had swept through their camp on the trail west. He had tried to shield his infant son, Sam, from the cold reality of death. He had failed. The universe did not reward saviors. It punished them for their hubris. Let the sheriff handle it, Ethan said, his voice flat. He turned to go back inside, the conversation over as far as he was concerned. Sheriff Miller's out of town, Jebediah called after him. Won't be back for 2 days. By then, it'll be done. Just thought you should know. Ethan paused in the doorway, his back to his neighbor. The silence of his home seemed to press in on him, heavier than before. He felt a flicker of something he had long since buried, a hot, righteous anger. It was an old, familiar feeling, a ghost from a time when he had believed in things like justice and honor. He had no place for such notions anymore. They were luxuries like hope. Yet, the image of a woman being sold like a mare in the grimy confines of the Redemption Saloon stuck in his mind like a burr. He saw Sarah's face for a fleeting, painful instant, her gentle smile, the trust in her eyes. He pushed the memory away, a reflexive, violent act of self-preservation. He would not go to town. He would not get involved. It was not his fight. He spent the rest of the day working with a ferocity that bordered on punishment, mending fences with sharp, angry movements, his thoughts a storm he refused to acknowledge. But as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, lonely shadows across the valley, he knew he was lying to himself. He could not stay here, safe in his fortress of solitude, while that particular brand of ugliness took root just a few miles away. Some lines, once crossed, stained everything around them. With a curse that was swallowed by the wind, he stripped the saddle from his workhorse and threw it onto the back of his faster, stronger stallion. He did not know what he would do when he got there. He only knew that he had to go. The silence he had so carefully cultivated had been broken, not by a sound, but by the echo of his own abandoned conscience. The journey to redemption was a ride through his own internal landscape. The setting sun bled across the sky, a wound of orange and purple that mirrored the turmoil inside him. He remembered the eager hope that had carried him west 5 years ago, with Sarah at his side, her belly swollen with their child. They had dreamed of a life here, a dynasty built on love and hard work. He saw the vast, empty plains not as a lonely expanse, but as a canvas for their future. The silence then had been peaceful, filled with unspoken promises. Now it was just empty. Every mile closer to town felt like a step backward in time, toward the man he used to be, a man who believed he could make a difference, a man who thought he could protect the people he loved. It was a fool's errand, and yet his horse galloped on, eating up the distance with a steady, relentless rhythm, carrying him toward a conflict he did not want, for reasons he refused to understand. Redemption was little more than a single dusty street flanked by false-fronted buildings, an island of crude civilization in an ocean of wilderness. As Ethan rode in, the sounds of raucous laughter and tinny piano music spilled from the saloon, a stark violation of the evening quiet. He dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching rail with brisk, efficient movements. He could feel the eyes of the town on him. He rarely came in, and his presence was an event. He was a man who kept to himself, a figure of quiet speculation. Some knew parts of his story, but no one knew the whole of it. They saw the competent rancher, the hardened survivor. They did not see the man haunted by the ghosts of a woman and a child. He pushed through the saloon's swinging doors and stopped just inside, letting his eyes adjust to the smoky dimness. The place was packed, a sea of rough, unshaven faces, all turned toward a makeshift stage at the far end of the room. A portly man with a waxed mustache and a gaudy waistcoat was standing there, his voice booming over the crowd. And beside him, on a small wooden platform, stood a woman. The sight of her struck him with the force of a physical blow. Jebediah had said she was a lady, but the word was inadequate. She was a slash of vibrant color in a world of brown and gray. Her dress, though travel-worn and smudged with dust, was of fine, dark blue wool, cut in a style he hadn't seen since leaving the East. Her hair, the color of rich honey, was bundled loosely at the nape of her neck, with escaped tendrils framing a face of striking, classical beauty. But it was not her beauty that held him captive. It was her expression, in a place where she should have been broken, terrified, and pleading. She was none of those things. Her chin was high, her back was ramrod straight, and her dark, intelligent eyes swept over the leering crowd with an expression of such profound, regal contempt that it was almost breathtaking. She was terrified. He could see that in the faint tremor of her hands, clasped tightly in front of her. But she was hiding it behind a wall of pure, unadulterated pride. And now, gentlemen, the auctioneer bellowed, the prize of the evening, a fine, educated woman, skilled in household management, reading, and writing. Her contract of indenture is for a period of 5 years. 5 years of loyal, obedient service to the highest bidder. Let's start the bidding at $100. A wave of crude remarks and laughter rolled through the crowd. Men shouted out bids, their eyes crawling over her like insects. Ethan felt that cold, righteous anger solidify into a shard of ice in his gut. This was not just wrong, it was a desecration. He watched her face, saw the flicker of pain in her eyes as a particularly foul comment reached her ears. She flinched, but her composure did not break. She stood there, enduring it, a solitary island of dignity in a sea of degradation. He saw not a stranger, but the embodiment of every value he had once fought for. 150, a grimy trapper yelled from the back. 200, countered a rancher with a possessive gleam in his eye. The two men who had brought her, Silas Croft's men, stood near the stage, their arms crossed, smirking. They were hard-faced and callous, enjoying the spectacle. Ethan's gaze locked onto them, and a cold certainty settled over him. These were not men who dealt in legal contracts. They were vultures profiting from misery. He looked back at the woman. He saw the subtle clenching of her jaw, the way her gaze had become fixed on a point on the far wall, a desperate attempt to mentally escape the cage her body was in. And in that moment, the careful walls he had built around his heart did not just crack, they shattered. He was not thinking of Sarah, not of his loss. He was thinking of the raw, searing injustice of this moment, and the quiet courage of the woman enduring it. 300, the rancher shouted, looking triumphant. The auctioneer beamed. $300, a fine price for a fine piece of property. Do I hear 350? Going once. Ethan moved. He didn't plan it. The action came from a place deeper than thought, from an instinct he had thought long dead. He strode forward, his boots echoing on the grimy floorboards. The crowd parted before him, sensing the cold, dangerous purpose in his stride. He stopped 10 feet from the stage, his gray eyes fixed on the auctioneer. $1,000, he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the din of the saloon like a razor. A stunned silence fell over the room. Every head turned to face him. The auctioneer's jaw dropped. The rancher who had been bidding stared at him with a mixture of anger and disbelief. $1,000 was a fortune. It was more than most men in that room saw in a year, more than enough to buy a small herd of cattle or a good parcel of land. It was a ludicrous, impossible sum. 1,000? The auctioneer stammered, his eyes wide. In gold, Ethan confirmed, his voice as cold and hard as river stone. He did not look at the woman, but he was intensely aware of her. He could feel her shocked gaze on him. The auctioneer looked at Croft's men, who exchanged a greedy, astonished glance and gave a slight nod. Their only goal was profit. The source was irrelevant. Sold, the auctioneer yelled, banging a gavel that appeared, as if from nowhere, to Mr. Cutter for $1,000. Ethan ignored the murmurs and stares of the crowd. He walked to the bar, pulled a heavy leather pouch from his coat, and counted out the gold coins onto the scarred-wood. The transaction was completed in a tense silence. He took the piece of paper, the supposed contract of indenture, without looking at it. He turned and walked to the stage. He held out his hand to the woman. For the first time, their eyes met. Her gaze was a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and a desperate, flickering hope. He saw intelligence there, and a strength that had not yet been broken. He kept his own expression neutral, offering nothing but a simple, direct gesture. For a long moment, she hesitated. Then, slowly, as if moving through a dream, she placed her hand in his. Her fingers were cold, but her touch was firm. He curled his hand around hers and helped her down from the platform. As her feet touched the floor, she stumbled slightly, her composure finally faltering. He instinctively put his other arm around her waist to steady her, pulling her close against him for a brief, jarring moment. She was trembling. He could feel the fine tremor running through her body. He could smell the faint scent of lavender and dust that clung to her. The contact was electric, a jolt of warmth and life that shot through his carefully guarded defenses. He released her immediately, stepping back, putting a professional distance between them. "Come," he said, his voice low and curt. "We're leaving." Without another word, he turned and led her through the silent, watching crowd, out of the smoky saloon and into the clean, cold air of the Wyoming night. The piano inside started up again, a clumsy, belated attempt to restore normalcy, but the spell had been broken. Ethan Cutter, the solitary rancher, the man who wanted nothing from the world, had just bought himself a wife. Or, at the very least, a world of trouble. He untied his horse, lifted her onto the saddle as if she weighed nothing, and then swung up behind her. He did not ask her name. She did not offer it. They rode out of town in a silence more profound and complicated than any he had ever known, the lights of redemption shrinking behind them, leaving them alone with the vast, star-dusted darkness and the thousand unspoken questions that hung between them. The ride back to the ranch was a long, silent ordeal. Ethan was acutely aware of the woman seated in front of him, her back stiff and straight, not leaning against him for support. He could feel the rigid control she was exerting over herself, a control that must have been costing her dearly. The moon had risen, a silver disk in an indigo sky, illuminating the landscape in shades of ghostly white and deep black. The air grew colder, and he felt her shiver. Without a word, he shrugged out of his heavy duster and draped it over her shoulders. She started at the contact but pulled the thick canvas around herself, a silent acknowledgement of the gesture. He tried to empty his mind, to focus on the familiar rhythm of the horse's gait, the feel of the cool leather reins in his hands. But his thoughts were a chaotic jumble. What had he done? He had spent $1,000, nearly all his savings, on a complete stranger, a woman he knew nothing about, inserting her directly into the center of his carefully constructed solitude. It was an act of pure, unadulterated madness. He told himself it was an act of principle. He had not bought a person. He had bought a piece of paper to set her free. He had rescued her from a grim fate, and when they reached his ranch, he would explain that she was a guest, free to leave whenever she wished. He would give her a horse and provisions, and send her on her way. To where, he did not know. That was her problem, not his. He had intervened, and now his responsibility was over. It was a clean, logical solution, one that would allow him to return to his quiet, orderly life. But even as he formulated the plan, he knew it was a lie. There was nowhere for a woman like her to go in this wilderness. Sending her off alone would be a death sentence, no different from leaving her to the mercy of the men in the saloon. He was caught in a trap of his own making, a snare laid by a long-dormant piece of his own soul. They arrived at the ranch well after midnight. The cabin was a dark silhouette against the star-strewn sky, the windows like vacant eyes. A single light burned in the smaller bunkhouse nearby, where his housekeeper, Martha, slept. He dismounted and turned to help the woman down. This time she was ready for him, accepting his hands on her waist and sliding to the ground with a grace that surprised him. She stood before him in the moonlight, the oversized duster hanging from her small frame, her face pale and shadowed. "Where are we?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, cultured, with a musical lilt he could not place. It was the first time she had spoken to him. "My ranch," he answered, his tone clipped and impersonal. "You'll be safe here." He led her to the cabin door, pushing it open. The main room was dark and cool, smelling of wood smoke and old leather. He moved with practiced familiarity to the stone fireplace, striking a match and lighting the oil lamp on the mantel. The room flickered into view, a simple, masculine space dominated by the hearth, a sturdy wooden table with 2 chairs, and shelves filled with practical items rather than decorations. It was meticulously clean but stark, a room that offered shelter but no comfort. "I have a housekeeper," he said, breaking the heavy silence. "Martha. She'll see to you in the morning. There's a guest room upstairs. You can use it." He gestured toward a narrow staircase in the corner. She did not move. She stood just inside the doorway, her gaze sweeping the room, her expression unreadable. She was looking at the details of his life, and he felt a strange, unwelcome sense of being exposed. Finally, her eyes came to rest on him. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do that?" He had been expecting the question, but the directness of it still caught him off guard. He had no simple answer, none that he was willing to share. "No one should be sold," he said gruffly. It was the truth, but it was a shallow, incomplete version of it. "You paid $1,000 for a principal?" she challenged, a flicker of spirit returning to her eyes. "That's a very expensive principal, Mr. Cutter." "Ethan Cutter." "Mr. Cutter," she repeated, testing the name. "My name is Elena de la Rosa." The name was as elegant and unexpected as she was. It did not belong in this rough-hewn cabin, in this harsh and unforgiving land. "You are not a slave here, Miss de la Rosa," he stated, turning to stir the embers in the fireplace, needing something to do with his hands. "That contract is meaningless. You're my guest. In the morning, we can discuss what you plan to do next." He was reasserting his plan, as much for his own benefit as for hers. "What I plan to do next," a sound that was almost a laugh, but brittle and humorless, escaped her lips. "Mr. Cutter, I have no plans. I have nothing. The men who brought me here, they took everything." He turned back to face her. In the warm lamplight, he could see the exhaustion etched onto her face, the faint purple shadows beneath her eyes. The proud defiance she had worn in the saloon was gone, replaced by a raw, devastating vulnerability. He felt an unwelcome pang of something that felt dangerously like compassion. "Get some rest," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "Things will look clearer in the morning." She gave a small, weary nod. She picked up the small, worn satchel that was her only luggage and moved toward the stairs. "Thank you, Mr. Cutter," she said formally, her gaze not quite meeting his. "For your principal." He watched her ascend the stairs until she disappeared from view. He stood alone in the quiet room, the silence returning, but it was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with her presence, with the faint scent of lavender she had left behind, and with the immense, terrifying weight of his own impulsive action. He sank into one of the chairs at the table, running a hand over his tired face. He had not brought a guest into his home. He had brought in a storm, and he had a sinking feeling that his carefully ordered world was about to be torn apart. The next morning, Ethan rose at his usual hour, before the dawn, but his routine felt alien. The knowledge that someone else was sleeping under his roof, a stranger whose life was now inexplicably tangled with his own, had unsettled his sleep. He found Martha already in the main cabin's kitchen, a small, wiry woman in her 60s with shrewd, kind eyes and an unflappable demeanor. She had worked for him for 3 years, coming over from the bunkhouse each day, managing his home with a quiet competence that he deeply valued. She was the one person whose presence did not disrupt his solitude. She looked up from the stove, where she was making coffee, her gaze sharp and questioning. "Jebediah's boy rode by an hour ago," she said without preamble. "Told me you caused quite a stir in town last night. Told me you came home with company." Ethan poured himself a mug of coffee, his back to her. "There was trouble. I handled it." "You handled it with $1,000 and a woman in your guest room," Martha retorted, her tone dry. "That's a new kind of handling for you." Ethan, she was not impertinent, merely direct. She had earned that right. He turned, leaning against the counter. She was being sold. I couldn't let it happen. Martha studied his face for a long moment. Then her expression softened. "No," she said quietly. "I suppose you couldn't." She knew about Sarah and Sam. She had never spoken of them directly, but she knew. "What's her name?" "Elena de la Rosa." "Well," Martha said, bustling again, Elena de la Rosa is going to need a hot breakfast and a friendly face. You could provide the first. I'll handle the second. You look like you're about to face a firing squad. A short while later, Elena descended the stairs. She had washed her face and tied her hair back neatly, but she wore the same travel-stained dress. In the clear light of day, her exhaustion was even more apparent, but so was her innate poise. She stopped when she saw Martha, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Good morning, miss," Martha said, her voice warm and matter-of-fact. "I'm Marta. I keep this place from falling to ruin. Coffee's hot and breakfast is on the table. Come and sit." The simple, no-nonsense kindness seemed to steady Elena. She gave a small, grateful smile and took a seat at the table. Ethan was already there, nursing his coffee, his silence a palpable force in the room. The meal was a tense, quiet affair. Ethan ate quickly, his focus on his plate. Elena ate slowly, as if she hadn't had a proper meal in days. Martha moved between the stove and the table, her presence a much-needed buffer. After the meal, Ethan cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Miss de la Rosa," he began, falling back on the formal address. "We need to talk." Elena placed her fork down and folded her hands in her lap, her posture attentive. "Very well, Mr. Cutter. I meant what I said last night. You're not a prisoner here. That contract is ash. You are free to go." He laid out his flawed plan, the words sounding even more foolish and impractical in the light of day. "I can provide you with a horse, supplies, and some money. The stagecoach passes through Redemption once a week. It can take you east." She listened patiently, her dark eyes fixed on his face. When he finished, a faint, sad smile touched her lips. "And where exactly would I go, Mr. Cutter? I am from a family in Santa Fe. My father was a respected landowner. He was ruined by a man, a powerful American. Deceived, cheated out of his land. My parents are both dead. I have no one, no home to return to. The men who brought me here did so under the pretense of finding me a position as a governess in Denver. It was a lie. I have no money, no connections. The East is as foreign to me as the moon." Her words were delivered with a calm, devastating dignity that cut through his practical, detached solution. He had seen her as a problem to be solved, an intrusion to be removed. He had not allowed himself to see her as a person, a woman stripped of her entire world, utterly and completely alone. It was a loneliness that mirrored his own, yet was terrifyingly different. His was a fortress of his own choosing. Hers was a desolate, open plain with no shelter in sight. "I see," he said, the words inadequate. He looked away, his gaze falling on the empty chair at the table, the one Sarah used to occupy. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken truths. It was Martha who broke it. "Well, that's settled then," she announced briskly, as if it had been a simple business discussion. "She'll stay here. This house has more than enough room, and Lord knows I could use the help. You're as neat as a pin, Ethan, but you have all the domestic sensibilities of a rock." She turned to Elena. "You can earn your keep, child. Help me with the garden, the cooking, the mending. Gives you a place to stay and time to think. Better than wandering off to get eaten by a bear, I'd say." Elena looked from Martha's determined face to Ethan's conflicted one. A flicker of hope, the first genuine spark he had seen, lit her eyes. I would be very grateful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm a capable worker." Ethan felt a wave of something akin to panic. Martha had, in her infinite and frustrating wisdom, just cemented Elena's place in his home. He wanted to object, to insist on his original plan, but the words died in his throat. He looked at Elena, at the fragile hope on her face, and knew he could not be the one to extinguish it. He could not send her away. He was trapped. "Fine," he bit out, pushing back from the table. "She can stay. For now." He grabbed his hat and strode out of the cabin without another look back, escaping into the vast, open space of his ranch, the only place where he could still breathe. The neat, orderly fences of his property suddenly felt like the bars of a cage. The days that followed settled into a strange and unfamiliar rhythm. Ethan threw himself into his work with a renewed desperation, staying out on the range from dawn until dusk, seeking solace in physical exhaustion. He was polite but distant, his conversations with Elena limited to curt greetings in the morning and evening. He was acutely aware of her presence in his house, a subtle shift in the very atmosphere of the place. There were changes, small at first. The scent of baking bread sometimes met him at the door. A jar of wildflowers appeared on the mantelpiece. He would hear the low murmur of her voice as she and Martha worked in the garden they were expanding behind the cabin. These were the sounds and smells of a home, not just a shelter, and they unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Elena, for her part, was a quiet and diligent presence. She worked tirelessly alongside Martha, her soft hands quickly becoming calloused. She learned to mend his rough work clothes, to cook the simple, hearty fare he was used to, and to tend the growing vegetable patch with a gentle, patient skill. She rarely spoke to him directly, respecting the wall of silence he had erected, but he often felt her eyes on him, her gaze thoughtful and questioning. She was observing him, trying to understand the grim, solitary man who had saved her. And he, in turn, observed her. He watched from a distance as she coaxed green shoots from the stubborn soil, a look of quiet concentration on her face. He saw her resilience, the way she adapted to this hard, foreign life without complaint. She was not the fragile, decorative creature he had first assumed. There was a core of steel beneath her refined exterior, a strength that he was beginning to respect and, to his alarm, to admire. She was not a delicate thing. She was a survivor just like him. One evening, a week after her arrival, a sudden thunderstorm rolled in, a violent squall of wind and rain that rattled the windows and trapped them all inside. The temperature plummeted. After their silent dinner, Martha declared she was turning in early, leaving Ethan and Elena alone in the main room, the fire crackling in the hearth their only companion. The silence was no longer comfortable or neutral. It was charged, filled with everything that had been left unsaid between them. Elena was sitting in the room's only armchair, a piece of mending in her lap, though she was not sewing. She was staring into the flames, her profile etched by the flickering light. "This land is beautiful," she said softly, her voice startling him. "But it is a harsh beauty. It demands so much. It gives back what you put into it," he replied, his gaze also on the fire. "It's honest at least." "Honest," she repeated, considering the word. "Yes. It does not pretend to be something it is not." She paused, then turned her head to look at him. "Like you, Mr. Cutter." He stiffened slightly. "I don't know what you mean." "You build walls to keep the world out," she said, her gaze direct and unflinching. "But you bought my freedom. You offer me shelter. You pretend to be hard, but you are a man of honor. It is a confusing combination." He had no answer for that. He felt that uncomfortable sense of being seen, of his carefully constructed defenses being probed for weaknesses. He stood and added another log to the fire, needing the movement. As he turned back, his eyes fell upon a small object on a high shelf above the mantelpiece, almost hidden in the shadows. A small, intricately carved wooden bird. Elena's gaze followed his. "That's beautiful," she said. "Did you make it?" He hesitated for a long moment. No one ever asked about the things on that shelf. It was his private memorial, a collection of ghosts. "Yes," he said, his voice tight. "For whom?" she asked gently. The question was a key turning a lock he had thought rusted shut. The story came out of him in a low, halting voice, the words torn from a place of deep, unhealed pain. He told her about Sarah, about their dream of this ranch. He told her about the fever on the trail, how quickly it had taken her. And he told her about their son, Samuel, born in the back of a wagon, who had survived his mother by only 2 days. The wooden bird had been for him, a toy for a son who had never had the chance to play. When he finished, the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the drumming of the rain against the roof. He had not spoken those names aloud in years. The confession left him feeling raw and hollowed out. He expected pity, or perhaps awkward silence. Instead, when he finally dared to look at her, he saw that her eyes were shimmering with unshed tears. But it was not pity on her face. It was a profound, heartbreaking understanding. She rose from her chair and walked to the fireplace. She reached up and gently, reverently, touched the small wooden bird. "My father," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "carved me a horse just like this when I was a little girl. He smelled of leather and tobacco. He was a strong man, a good man. He believed in the law, in a man's word." She turned to face Ethan, her own story pouring out to fill the space his had created. "The man who took our land, Silas Croft, he came to us as a friend, an investor. He used the law to break the law. He forged documents, bribed officials. He ruined my father's name and took everything he had built. My father, he could not live with the dishonor. And my mother's heart simply broke soon after. I lost them both in the space of a month." She stood before him, 2 feet of space separating them, but the emotional chasm between them had vanished. They were no longer a solitary rancher and his unexpected ward. They were 2 survivors, 2 people who had lost everything, standing together in the wreckage. In her eyes, he saw his own grief reflected back at him, and in that shared vulnerability, a bond was forged, stronger and more real than any fence or wall he could ever build. He had an overwhelming urge to reach out, to comfort her, but he clenched his fists at his sides, the old habit of withholding, of keeping his distance, dying hard. But something had fundamentally shifted. The silence in the house was no longer his alone. It was theirs. The fragile peace born of their shared confessions settled over the ranch, changing the dynamic between them. The formal titles of Mr. Cutter and Miss de la Rosa were quietly abandoned, replaced by the simpler, more intimate Ethan and Elena. The wall of his silence had been breached, and while he remained a man of few words, the words he did speak to her now carried more weight. He found himself explaining the nuances of the land to her, pointing out the signs of changing weather in the clouds, showing her which plants were medicine and which were poison. She was a quick and eager student, her sharp mind soaking up the knowledge. He was discovering, to his constant surprise, that he enjoyed teaching her. He enjoyed the quiet companionship. But the outside world was not content to leave them in their secluded valley. The threat that had brought Elena to him had not vanished. It had merely been lying in wait. It arrived one afternoon when Ethan and Elena were riding the northern fence line, checking for breaks before the cattle were moved to the winter pasture. He was teaching her to ride astride, and she had taken to it with a natural grace that seemed to both annoy and impress him. They had stopped by the creek to let the horses drink when 2 riders appeared on the opposite ridge. Ethan saw them first. His body went still, his hand moving instinctively to rest on the butt of the pistol at his hip. They were not cowboys or ranchers. They were hard men, the kind who lived by the gun, and he recognized them instantly as the 2 who had been on the stage at the saloon, Silas Croft's men. "Stay behind me," he said to Elena, his voice a low command. He urged his horse forward, placing himself squarely between her and the newcomers. The 2 men rode down the ridge and stopped at the far bank of the creek, the water a clear boundary between them. The larger of the 2, a man with a brutish face and a cruel smirk, was the one who spoke. "Cutter," he said, his voice a gravelly sneer, "we heard you'd taken a liking to our property." "She's not property," Ethan replied, his voice dangerously calm. "And she's not yours. You've got no business on this land. Ride out." The man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Oh, we're not here for her. Not yet. We're here on behalf of our employer, Mr. Silas Croft. He's expanding his holdings. He's made a generous offer to buy up all the land in this valley. We're just delivering the good news." "I'm not selling," Ethan said flatly. "Not an offer you can refuse," the second man, who was leaner and quieter, added, his eyes fixed on Elena with a cold intensity. "Mr. Croft is a man who gets what he wants. He wants this valley, and he wants to tie up all his loose ends." The meaning was clear, a threat wrapped in the guise of a business transaction. They didn't just want the land. They wanted Elena. The brutish man's eyes narrowed. "We know who she is. Her father was a stubborn fool, too. Thought he could stand against Croft. We know he gave her papers, documents proving Croft's business methods. We want them back." Elena's breath hitched behind Ethan. He glanced back and saw the color drain from her face. "I have no papers," she said, her voice shaking slightly but firm. "He destroyed everything." "We don't believe you," the man snarled. "We'll get them back, one way or another." He looked from Elena's frightened face to Ethan's stony one. "Think about the offer, Cutter. It's better than the alternative." With that, they wheeled their horses around and galloped away, disappearing over the ridge as suddenly as they had appeared. The silence they left behind was heavy with menace. "They were lying," Elena said, her voice barely a whisper. "My father did have papers. A ledger, copies of the forged deeds. He gave them to me the day before he died. He told me to take them to the territorial governor in Cheyenne to see that justice was done. I had them hidden in the lining of my satchel. But Croft's men found them when they searched my things on the trail. I have nothing." Ethan turned in his saddle to face her fully. He saw the despair in her eyes, the crushing weight of her failure to protect her father's legacy. "It doesn't matter if you have them or not," he said, his voice grim. "They think you do, or they think you know what was in them. And that makes you a danger to them. They won't stop." The encounter shattered the fragile peace of their existence. The threat was no longer a distant memory of a sordid saloon. It was here, on their land, a shadow that now fell over every corner of the ranch. The stakes had been raised. Croft didn't just want Elena silenced. He wanted Ethan's land, the very sanctuary he had built. His solitude had not protected him. It had made him an isolated, vulnerable target. And by bringing Elena into his world, he had painted a target on her back as well. The days that followed were filled with a tense, watchful energy. Ethan no longer rode the long fences alone. He kept to the areas closer to the cabin. He spent an evening cleaning and oiling his rifle and his pistols, the familiar, methodical actions a grim preparation for a battle he knew was coming. He tried to maintain his distance from Elena, to fall back into his old patterns of emotional self-reliance. He told himself he was protecting her by not getting closer, by not giving her false hope, or making promises he couldn't keep. If he were to die defending this ranch, it was better that she feel gratitude, not love. It was a cold, hard logic, the same logic that had governed his life for 5 years. But Elena did not understand his logic. She saw his withdrawal as a rejection, a sign that she was a burden he regretted taking on. The easy companionship they had begun to build evaporated, replaced by a formal, painful courtesy. The warmth in her eyes when she looked at him was replaced by a guarded hurt. The misunderstanding hung between them, a wall of silence more formidable than any he had ever built. He was trying to protect her by pushing her away, and in doing so, he was causing her a deeper pain than any physical threat could. He saw the sorrow in her face at dinner, the way she avoided his gaze, and it twisted a knife in his gut. But he held firm, believing his coldness was a necessary cruelty, a shield for her heart. He was a fool, and he was breaking both their hearts with his stubborn, grief-stricken pride. The threat from Silas Croft was escalating, but the most dangerous conflict was the one raging within the walls of his own cabin and within the fortress of his own heart. The first direct assault was not on them, but on their livelihood. Ethan woke one night to a hellish orange glow against his window and the terrified bellowing of his cattle. He grabbed his rifle and was out the door in an instant, his heart pounding with a cold dread. The large hay barn, filled with the winter feed he had spent all summer harvesting, was engulfed in flames. The fire raged with an unnatural speed, the dry timber and hay catching like tinder. There was no saving it. All he could do was work frantically to drive the panicked cattle away from the inferno, to prevent the fire from spreading to the other outbuildings or the cabin itself. Elena and Martha were there moments later, their faces pale in the demonic light of the flames. Without needing to be told, they began helping, their movements swift and purposeful, their nightgowns whipping in the hot wind generated by the blaze. They worked as a team, their fear eclipsed by the urgency of the moment. By the time the fire finally burned itself out, leaving a smoldering, blackened skeleton where the barn had stood, dawn was breaking. The rising sun revealed a scene of devastation. The winter feed was gone. A significant portion of his life's work had been turned to ash in a single night. He found a discarded oil can near the edge of the ruin. Arson. It was a message, written in fire and smoke. We can take what is yours whenever we want. He stood staring at the wreckage, a cold, hard fury building inside him. This was his home, his sanctuary, and they had violated it. Ethan, Elena's voice was soft beside him. She held out a cup of coffee. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair wild, but her eyes were clear and steady. Are you all right? They destroyed 5 months of work, he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He was locking it down, burying the rage where it couldn't control him. I'll have to sell off half the herd before winter. I won't be able to feed them. We will rebuild it, she said with a quiet intensity that surprised him. Martha and I will help. We will salvage what we can. It is not over. He looked at her then, truly looked at her. He had expected to see fear or despair. Instead, he saw a fierce, unwavering resolve. She was not talking about his barn, his herd. She was talking about their home. In that moment, the distance he had so carefully manufactured between them seemed like a pathetic, cowardly lie. She was not a guest, not a burden. She was a partner, standing with him in the ashes, ready to fight. The realization shook him to his core. His attempt to protect her by pushing her away had been a profound miscalculation. Her strength did not come from being shielded. It came from facing the danger head-on. The knowledge did not bring him comfort. It brought terror, because as he looked at her determined, soot-streaked face, he finally admitted the truth to himself, a truth he had been fighting since the moment he saw her in that saloon. He was falling in love with her, and in his world, love was not a source of strength. It was a fatal weakness. It was the one thing he had sworn he would never risk again. The thought of losing her, of facing that particular abyss a second time, was more terrifying than Silas Croft and 100 of his men. The fire had destroyed his barn, but had ignited a far more dangerous blaze within him, one that threatened to consume the very foundations of his solitary existence. He took the coffee from her, their fingers brushing, and the simple contact was enough to make him want to pull her close and at the same time run for the hills. He did neither. He just stood there, drinking the coffee, watching his life's work smolder, and knew with a grim certainty that the real fight had only just begun. They knew the fire was only a prelude. The final confrontation was coming, as surely as winter. Ethan spent the next 2 days fortifying the ranch. He boarded up several of the smaller windows, leaving only narrow slits for firing. He brought extra boxes of ammunition into the cabin and stacked sacks of flour and grain to create barricades. He worked with a silent, grim efficiency, the skills from his time in the war returning with a terrible, unwelcome ease. Martha watched him, her face etched with worry, but she did not question him. She simply ensured they had enough food, water, and medical supplies inside the main house. Elena worked alongside him, her face pale but resolute. She followed his instructions without question, her hands steady as she helped him move heavy furniture. He tried to remain detached, to treat her as he would a soldier under his command, but it was impossible. Every shared glance, every brief touch as they worked together, heightened the unbearable tension between them. He was preparing to defend his home, and he was terrified that in doing so, he would be presiding over a reenactment of his greatest failure. The cabin no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a tomb waiting to be sealed. The attack came on the 3rd night, under the cover of a new moon. The darkness was absolute, a thick, black velvet that swallowed the landscape. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the soft sigh of the wind. Ethan was sitting in the dark by the main window, his rifle across his lap, when he heard it, the faint, unnatural snap of a twig. It was the only warning he would get. "They're here," he said, his voice a low whisper in the darkness. "Get down. Stay away from the windows." Martha and Elena immediately dropped to the floor behind the heavy oak table he had overturned. The first gunshot shattered the night, the bullet ripping through the window and burying itself in the opposite wall with a vicious thud. The siege had begun. What followed was a terrifying symphony of violence. Gunshots exploded from the darkness outside, answered by the methodical, deafening roar of Ethan's rifle. He moved between the windows, a phantom in the dark, never staying in one place for more than a single shot. He was calm, his movements economical, his training taking over. But beneath the cold precision, his heart was hammering against his ribs. He was not just fighting for his land. He was fighting for the two women huddled on the floor, their lives now completely in his hands. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. "How many?" Elena whispered from behind the barricade. "4, maybe 5, he grunted, reloading with swift, practiced movements. "They're trying to draw my fire, figure out where I am." For nearly an hour, the battle raged. The cabin was filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, the air thick with tension. Glass shattered, wood splintered, but Ethan's relentless, accurate fire kept them at bay, preventing them from making a direct rush on the house. Then there was a lull. The shooting stopped. The silence that fell was more menacing than the noise. "They're changing tactics," Ethan whispered, his eyes scanning the impenetrable darkness. "They'll try to burn us out, or come in from the back." He moved toward the rear of the cabin, toward the small kitchen window. As he peered out, he saw a flicker of movement near the woodshed. 2 figures, moving low and fast toward the blind spot at the back of the house. He raised his rifle, but before he could fire, a loud crash came from the front of the cabin. A diversion. He spun around, firing a shot toward the sound, but he knew it was a feint. "They're coming the back," he yelled. Just then, the back door burst open, splintered from its hinges by a heavy blow. A large, shadowy figure filled the doorway. It was the brutish man from the creek, the leader. He raised his pistol, a triumphant sneer on his face in the faint moonlight. Ethan swung his rifle around, but he knew he would be too slow. In that split second, a blur of motion came from the floor near the hearth. Elena. She had grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, and with a desperate cry, she swung it with all her might, striking the intruder across the side of his head. The blow was not powerful enough to disable him, but it was shocking and painful. He roared in anger, staggering sideways, his aim thrown off. His pistol fired, the bullet going wild, tearing a chunk out of the ceiling. That single moment was all Ethan needed. He fired his rifle from the hip. The sound was deafening inside the small cabin. The intruder grunted, a look of stunned surprise on his face, before collapsing to the floor. But the danger was not over. The second man who had been with him appeared in the broken doorway. Ethan was still cycling the next round into his rifle. He was exposed. The man raised his gun. Suddenly, a deafening blast came from upstairs. The man in the doorway jerked, cried out, and stumbled backward into the night. Ethan stared in disbelief toward the top of the stairs. Martha stood there, a massive, old shotgun clutched in her hands, smoke curling from its barrels. Her face was as white as a sheet, but her grip was steady. "Always keep one for emergencies," she said, her voice trembling only slightly. The immediate threat inside the cabin was neutralized, but the fight was not over. The men outside, realizing their plan had failed, unleashed a furious volley of gunfire against the house. They were pinned down. Ethan knew they couldn't hold out forever. They would eventually run out of ammunition, or the attackers would simply set fire to the cabin itself. He looked at Elena, who was huddled back behind the barricade, the iron poker still clutched in her hands. Her face was pale with terror, but her eyes were blazing with a fierce, defiant light. He saw not a victim, but a warrior. The sight of her courage, the incredible risk she had taken for him, shattered the last of his emotional armor. The cold logic of self-preservation, the fear of loss, it all burned away in the heat of that moment, replaced by a single, overwhelming certainty. He could not lose her. He would not. "I have to get outside," he said, his mind racing. "Draw them away from the house. Give you a chance." "It's suicide," she breathed, her eyes wide with fear. "It's the only way." He looked at her, and in the dark, smoky room, he let her see it all. The fear, the desperation, and the fierce, protective emotion that he could no longer name. Elena. He started, but he didn't know how to say it, how to voice the terrifying truth that was roaring in his heart. Before he could speak, she seemed to understand. She reached out and grabbed the front of his shirt, her grip surprisingly strong. "Then I will create a diversion," she said, her voice low and urgent. "No," he said fiercely. "It's too dangerous. More dangerous than waiting here to die," she countered. She pointed to the oil lamps. "If I throw a lit lamp out the front window, they will all look that way. It will give you the seconds you need to get out the back." It was a desperate, reckless plan, but it was a good one. He looked into her eyes and saw a strength that matched his own. He had been trying to protect a fragile flower, but he had been living with a wildfire. He gave a single, sharp nod. "On my signal," he said. He moved to the broken back door, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He took a deep breath and yelled, "Now!" He heard the crash of glass from the front of the house, followed by a bright whoosh of flame as the oil ignited in the yard. Shouts of surprise and alarm rose from the attackers. In that instant of chaos, Ethan slipped out the back door and melted into the darkness. He circled around the house, moving with the silence of a predator. He saw the remaining two gunmen distracted by the fire, their backs to him. The fight was short and brutal. He was no longer a man defending property. He was a man defending his entire world. When it was over, an eerie silence descended upon the ranch, broken only by the crackling of the small fire in the yard and the ragged sound of his own breathing. The threat was over. They were safe. He stumbled back into the cabin. Elena rushed to him, her face a mask of terror and relief. "Are you hurt?" she cried, her hands fluttering over his arms, his chest, checking for injuries. "No," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. He gripped her arms, holding her still, needing to feel that she was real, that she was unharmed. He looked down at her fierce, beautiful, soot-stained face, and the words he had held back for so long finally broke free, torn from him by the sheer terror of almost losing her. "I thought I'd lost you," he rasped, his voice raw with an emotion he had sworn he would never feel again. He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her in a desperate, possessive embrace. "I built these walls to keep everyone out, to never feel that again. But you walked right through them without even trying." He buried his face in her hair, the scent of her, of smoke and lavender, filling his senses. "I love you, Elena." The confession hung in the air, as shocking and explosive as the gunfire that had preceded it. He felt her stiffen in his arms, and then, with a choked sob, she seemed to melt against him, her arms circling his neck, holding on as if she would never let go. "I love you too, Ethan," she whispered into his shoulder. "I think I have from the very beginning." They stood there for a long time, clinging to each other in the wreckage of his home, the remnants of the battle all around them. The fortress of his solitude had been besieged and broken, not by the men with guns, but by the courageous woman in his arms. And for the first time in 5 years, standing amidst the chaos and destruction, Ethan Cutter felt completely, utterly whole. He was no longer a man defined by what he had lost. He was a man defined by what he had, against all odds, just found. The dawn that followed the battle was quiet and serene, a stark contrast to the violence of the night. The rising sun illuminated the scars on the land and the cabin, the shattered windows, the splintered wood, the blackened patch of grass where the lamp had burned. But inside, a fragile, powerful peace had taken root. The immediate aftermath was a blur of practicalities. They tended to a graze on Martha's arm, secured the bodies of the attackers for the sheriff, and began the daunting task of assessing the damage. Yet through it all, an invisible thread now connected Ethan and Elena, a current of shared understanding and unspoken emotion that made every glance, every brief touch, profoundly significant. Later that morning, as Martha was resolutely sweeping up broken glass, Ethan found Elena standing on the porch, looking out at the valley. The rising sun caught the honey tones in her hair, and she seemed to absorb its light, a beacon of warmth against the backdrop of destruction. He came to stand beside her, the comfortable silence between them a new and precious thing. The sheriff will be here by noon, he said. We'll have to tell him everything. About Silas Croft, she said, her voice heavy. Even with these men gone, he is still out there. He will not stop. We won't be waiting for him, Ethan replied, his voice firm with a resolve that had been forged in the night's battle. We'll give the sheriff a full statement. What you know about his crimes, combined with this attack, it will be enough. We'll face him with the law, not with guns. He paused, turning to face her. We will face it together. The promise in those words was immense. He was no longer planning a solitary defense. He was planning a shared future. He reached into the pocket of his worn trousers and pulled out a small, simple object, a plain gold band, warm from his skin. It was not fancy or ornate, but it shone with the soft, deep luster of old gold. This was my mother's, he said, his voice quiet and steady. He held it out to her in the palm of his hand. She gave it to my father on their wedding day, said it was all she had to offer. He told her it was everything. He looked into her eyes, his own gray gaze clear and direct, stripped of all its former guards and shadows. I know this is not the right time, with everything in ruins. And I know I am not the man you would have chosen in your old life. I am a quiet man, and I carry scars you cannot see. But my world was empty, Elena. It was just a place of survival. You brought life back into it. You brought me back to life. He took a deep breath, the words both terrifying and liberating. This isn't about obligation or gratitude for what happened last night. This is about building something new, right here out of these ashes. Together. Elena de la Rosa, will you marry me? Tears welled in her eyes, shimmering like morning dew. She did not hesitate. She reached out and placed her hand over his, her fingers closing around the simple ring. Oh, Ethan, she whispered, a radiant smile breaking through her tears. In my old life, I was meant to marry for status, for land. I never would have known a man like you, a man of honor, of quiet strength, of such profound goodness. She looked from the ring to his face, her expression filled with a love so pure and powerful it took his breath away. Yes, she said, her voice ringing with certainty. Yes, I will marry you. He took the ring and slid it onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, sealing the promise not just of a shared future, but of a healed past. When Sheriff Miller and his deputies arrived, they found not a scene of grim survival, but one of quiet, determined hope. The story poured out of them. Elena's testimony of Silas Croft crimes in Santa Fe, the escalating threats, the arson, and the final, desperate siege. The captured thug, faced with a rope and the unyielding gaze of Ethan Cutter, corroborated everything, trading his testimony against Croft for a lesser sentence. The wheels of justice, so often slow and uncertain on the frontier, began to turn with a surprising speed, fueled by the flagrant violence of the attack. The community of redemption, which had once gossiped about the solitary rancher and the mysterious woman he had bought, now saw them in a new light. They were not just curiosities, they were their own. They were people who had stood their ground and fought back against the kind of lawless greed that threatened them all. When the news of their engagement spread, it was met not with suspicion, but with a quiet, heartfelt approval. In the weeks that followed, the ranch was filled with the sounds of hammers and saws. Jebediah and the other neighboring ranchers arrived unbidden, bringing lumber and strongbacks. The men of the town came out on weekends. They rebuilt the barn, bigger and stronger than before. They helped Ethan replace the shattered windows and the broken door of his cabin. The women of the town, led by a determined Martha, brought food and supplies, filling the small home with the aromas of baking and the sounds of friendly chatter. Ethan, who had held himself apart for so long, found himself surrounded by a community he never knew he had. They clapped him on the back, offered him advice, and treated Elena with a gentle, profound respect. They saw the light she had brought back to his eyes, the way he watched her, the small, unconscious smiles that now touched his lips. They saw two broken people who had found a way to become whole together, and in their story, they found a reflection of the frontier's own promise, that a new life could always be built, even on scorched earth. Their wedding, held on a crisp autumn day under the wide Wyoming sky, was not a grand affair, but the entire town was there to witness it, their presence a powerful testament to the couple's place in the heart of the community. 2 years later, spring had come to the valley with a gentle, insistent beauty. The creek ran full and clear, the grasslands were a vibrant, impossible green, and the wildflowers Elena had planted around the cabin were a riot of color. The ranch was no longer a fortress. It was a home, thriving and alive. The new barn stood proud and strong, and the herd of cattle that grazed peacefully on the hills was larger than it had ever been. Silas Croft was a distant memory, a name spoken in cautionary tales, his empire having crumbled under the weight of his crimes, his trial in Cheyenne having been swift and decisive. Justice had been served. Inside the cabin, which now had a new wing added on, the late afternoon sun streamed through the windows. The room was filled with the scent of baking bread and the soft gurgle of a baby. Ethan sat at the table, mending a piece of leather tack, his large, calloused hands moving with a practiced, gentle skill. His face had lost its hard, chiseled edges. The lines around his eyes were from smiling now, not from squinting into a lonely horizon. Elena sat in a rocking chair near the hearth, the chair he had built for her their first winter together. In her arms, she held their son, 10-month-old Samuel Mateo Cutter, a beautiful child with his mother's dark eyes and a dusting of his father's sandy hair. He was sleeping soundly, one tiny fist curled around her finger. The small, carved wooden bird that had once sat alone on the mantelpiece now hung from a string above the baby's cradle, twisting gently in the breeze. Ethan looked up from his work, his gaze falling on his wife and child. A feeling of such profound peace and gratitude washed over him that it almost hurt. This was the life he had dreamed of with Sarah, a ghost of a dream he had thought buried forever. But this was not that life. This was a new one, a different one, forged in fire and fear and an improbable, resilient love. It was real. Elena looked up, feeling his eyes on her, and her face broke into a warm, radiant smile. It was a smile that still, after 2 years, had the power to make his heart ache with love. "He has your stubborn chin," she whispered, so as not to wake the baby. "He has your beautiful eyes," he countered softly, putting down his leatherwork and rising from his chair. He walked over to her and knelt by the side of the rocking chair. He gently stroked his son's soft cheek, his touch full of a wonder that never faded. Then he looked at Elena, his partner, his wife, the woman who had faced down her own destruction and had not only survived but had triumphed. She had not been sold that day in the saloon. She had been liberated, and in turn, she had liberated him. Her last laugh was not one of vengeance or malice. It was the quiet, joyful sound of a baby's breath, the warmth of a loving home, the steadfast presence of the man she loved. It was the beautiful, ordinary, extraordinary life she had built. He leaned in and kissed her, a soft, lingering kiss filled with unspoken gratitude and a love as vast and enduring as the Wyoming sky outside their window. She rested her head against his, her eyes closing in contentment. The silence that filled the room was no longer empty or lonely. It was rich and full, brimming with life and the quiet promise of all the years to come. He was home. They were home.